This was, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. My family, Mom, Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa and I were staying in a cozy A-frame cabin in northern Washington. The area was beautiful. Dense forests, a lake shimmering just outside the cabin, and the perfect setting for a relaxing getaway. The trip was mostly planned so we could try out our new boat on the lake, and so far, everything had been great. We spent our days boating, hanging out as a family, and just enjoying the peaceful escape. One afternoon, my family decided to make a run to a convenience store, about 30-45 minutes down a dirt road. I opted to stay behind, wanting to relax and enjoy the cabin by myself. I was old enough to be left alone, so it didn't seem like a big deal. At first, everything was fine. I wandered around the cabin, listening to music and admiring the sunset framed perfectly over the lake through the massive windows. Chalets like this one are known for their large, open windows, and while it made the sunset breathtaking, it also meant there were no curtains to shield the dark forest once the sun went down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin felt different, quieter, darker. I kept busy exploring the place, but out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention. Down by the small dock, about 125 meters away, I thought I saw movement. It was subtle, just the faintest flicker of motion near the edge of the forest. My first thought was that it was probably a deer or another animal. Washington's forests are full of wildlife after all, so I brushed it off and went about my evening. A little while later, I headed to the bathroom, which was down a hallway away from the large windows. That's when the uneasiness set in. It started as a vague, unsettling feeling, like something was wrong, and it only grew stronger. I wanted to check the cabin, maybe look outside, but I was stuck in the bathroom, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The longer I stayed there, the worse it got. Every sound, the rain tapping on the roof, the creak of the cabin's old wooden beams, felt amplified, like a countdown I couldn't ignore. By the time I finished up and rushed out of the bathroom, I was on edge. I practically sprinted to the large windows, peering out into the forest and the moonlit lake beyond. Nothing. Just the still, lifeless trees and the lake reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Then it hit me. That sinking, primal feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off. It's all in your head, I told myself. But deep down, I knew this time was different. I turned around, and my heart nearly stopped. At the other end of the hallway, through the clear glass door, something was standing there. It was a deer, but it wasn't on all fours. It was standing upright, like a person. My mind reeled, screaming the word, "Skinwalker." I froze, refusing to acknowledge it. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. Without thinking, I closed my eyes, spun around, and sprinted back to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and sat in silence, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Minutes felt like hours as I huddled in the bathroom, the only room without windows. I barely moved, barely breathed, just listening. But the cabin was silent, save for the rain tapping on the roof. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard my family return. I hesitated before coming out of the bathroom, terrified of what I might see. But when I stepped out, there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. The hallway was empty, the glass door undisturbed. The next morning, we checked around the cabin and the dock, but there were no footprints, no signs that anything had been there. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life, and I'll never forget the feeling of absolute terror as I stared down that hallway. Believe me or don't, but I know what I felt. And even if it wasn't real, it was as scary as if it had been. I've told this story more times than I can count, and even now, it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. To set the stage, I've never been a fan of camping. Growing up, my parents sent me to summer camp in Colorado every year, which inevitably included at least one overnight trip into the woods. I hated it. The heavy pack, the lack of toilets, the spiders that always found their way into my tent. But when I turned 16 and became a counselor in training, I thought my attitude might shift. After all, the rumors about these trips were enticing. Late-night drinking, sneaking off to smoke weed, and the occasional hookup once the campers were asleep. This trip, however, turned out to be something entirely different. The day started like any other camping trip. There were about 30 of us, 20 or so campers aged 13, 14, 4 counselors, and 4 of us counselors in training. We hiked in single file, the kids' chatter and laughter drowning out most of the sounds of the forest. Hours passed as we trudged through dense, marshy trails and then up a steep incline lined with aspens and evergreens. I wasn't in the best shape, so by the time we reached the hill, I had fallen to the back of the group, along with Jordan, another counselor in training, and 2 straggling campers. We chatted to pass the time, losing ourselves in conversation, and before we realized it, the main group had disappeared around a bend ahead of us. At first, we didn't think much of it, but after about 30 minutes, the landscape began to change. The trees grew sparse and lifeless, most of them blackened from an old wildfire or killed by disease. The air felt heavier, quieter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then we saw it. A derelict cabin sitting alone in the middle of the dead forest. The cabin looked untouched by whatever fire had scorched the surrounding trees, and its eerie presence stopped us in our tracks. One of the campers let out a startled scream when a twig snapped behind us, and Jordan and I laughed nervously until we turned to see what had caused the noise. About 20 feet down the trail stood a man. He had a tangled nest of black hair and a long, unkempt beard. His clothes were worn and dirty, and he carried no supplies, no pack, no water, nothing to suggest he was hiking. His eyes were locked on us as he moved slowly toward us. We froze. Jordan managed a small wave and muttered, "Let's catch up to the group." We started walking faster, but the man called out in a low mumble, his words hard to hear. Jordan, to my surprise, turned back and asked him to repeat himself. "Going camping?" the man asked, his voice clearer now, but no less unsettling. Jordan nodded and said yes, trying to keep things polite. The man smiled, a slow, creepy smile, and replied, "Better be careful." We nodded and mumbled a thank you, then sped up the trail, not daring to look back. The man didn't follow us. He just stood there, watching us until the winding path finally obscured him from view. When we caught up with the group, we immediately told the counselors about the encounter. They brushed it off, saying the man probably lived in the cabin and was just curious. But I couldn't shake the unease I felt, the way his gaze lingered, the ominous tone of his warning. When we arrived at the campsite, I tried to put it out of my mind. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jordan and another counselor in training, snuck over to my tent with 2 warm Mike's Harders they had stolen. I pulled out a joint I'd been saving, and we decided to head to the riverbank, where we'd washed our dishes earlier to hang out. The spot was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that feels too heavy, like it's pressing down on you. The man from earlier kept popping into my head, and Jordan must have noticed my discomfort. He handed me his hoodie, and one of the girls joked about switching tents so I could sleep with him instead. I didn't object. After smoking and chatting for a bit, we returned to our tents, which were pitched slightly away from the main group. We sipped on the Mike's Harders and started telling scary stories, the kind of goofy, half-made-up tales you share on camping trips. One of the boys was midway through a story when he stopped suddenly, his voice trailing off. In the silence, we all heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching on pine needles, about 40 feet away, near one of the campers' tents. We strained to listen, but the noises stopped. Assuming it was just a camper getting up to use the bathroom, we decided to call it a night, our nerves already frayed. Jordan and I crawled into our tent, where we awkwardly made out for a bit before finally falling asleep. I'm not sure what time it was, but it must have been late when I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps near my tent. Shot through with adrenaline, I froze, trying to quiet my breathing and stay as still as possible. The footsteps were close, less than 3 feet from the front of the tent, and they seemed to be pacing back and forth. Panicked, I turned slightly to wake Jordan, but the moment I saw his empty spot next to me, my fear started to fade. Relieved, I assumed the footsteps I was hearing must have been his. I closed my eyes, ready to drift back to sleep, when I heard the tent unzip. The familiar sound put me at ease, and I felt Jordan slide into the tent and lie down beside me. A moment later, he wrapped an arm around me, pulling me into a lazy, sleepy embrace. With the comfort of his presence, my eyelids grew heavy again, and I started to relax. But then, I realized I had to pee. Trying not to disturb him, I muttered something about going to the bathroom and began unzipping my sleeping bag. Jordan shifted, annoyed by the noise, and turned over. I noticed he lazily pulled the hood of his blue sweatshirt up over his head before going still again. Quietly, I unzipped the tent, glanced around the campsite to reassure myself, and then slipped out to head to the designated pee zone. The campsite was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong in the woods. I made my way across the clearing, trying not to think about the unsettling events earlier in the day. I just reached the spot, squatted, and pulled my pants down when I heard rustling back at the campsite. Someone rummaging through our supplies and bags. My heart raced as I clumsily tried to pull my pants back up. In my panic, I grabbed a branch for balance, and it snapped loudly under my weight. I froze, holding my breath, and turned toward the noise. That's when I saw a figure moving through the campsite, heading in my direction. Before I could react, a bright flashlight beam blinded me, growing larger as whoever it was came closer. My panic rose until a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Sorry, it's just me," Jordan said, his tone casual. Relief washed over me, but then he asked a question that stopped me cold. "Have you seen my blue hoodie? I know you gave it back to me earlier, but I think one of the campers might have stolen it from my bag while I was sleeping." Confused, I stammered, "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." Jordan's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" he said. "I haven't been in the tent since we came back from the river. I went down there earlier to check for my hoodie, but when I couldn't find it, I thought I'd look through the boys' bags. That's when I saw you leaving the tent." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. My confusion turned to sheer terror as the realization dawned. The person who had been in the tent with me wasn't Jordan. Jordan noticed my panic and pressed me to explain. I managed to tell him, in shaky whispers, that someone else had been lying next to me in the tent. He didn't believe me at first and insisted we go back to check. Slowly and as quietly as we could, we crept back to the tent. Jordan flicked on his flashlight, and when the beam hit the nylon lining, we both froze. There was a shadow, a distinct outline of a man, lying still inside the tent. Jordan let out a high-pitched scream, and I don't remember much after that. We sprinted to the cluster of tents where the adult counselors were sleeping, frantically shaking them awake and yelling that there was a man in our tent. Groggy and confused, they didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what we were saying at first. But then a commotion broke out near our tent. By the time the counselors rushed to investigate, the tent was empty. The man was gone. Our gear was scattered everywhere, as if he'd knocked it over in a hurry. The counselors quickly radioed back to camp for help, and though they tried to keep us calm, it was clear they were just as terrified as we were. None of us slept that night. At sunrise, armed counselors arrived to escort us back to camp. As we hiked down, one of the campers found Jordan's blue hoodie tied around a tree along the path, like a sinister marker. Jordan refused to take it back, and we left it there. To this day, I can't say for sure if the man in the tent was the same one we'd encountered on the trail, but his face and the events of that night still haunt me. The 4th of July weekend in 2011 was supposed to be a fun escape into the woods, a chance to unwind at my buddy Troy's cabin. Troy had set the whole thing up. He even planned to introduce me to a girl he thought I'd hit it off with. I was all in, ready for a carefree holiday weekend. Things started off great. Troy introduced me to the girl, and we clicked right away. It wasn't long before we found ourselves downstairs, enjoying some alone time. Meanwhile, Troy headed out for a bit, leaving us to our privacy. Not long after, though, I heard unfamiliar voices upstairs. Curious, I pulled myself away and went to check it out. That's when I saw Troy standing there, with Ace. Now Ace and I had bad blood. I hated the guy, and seeing him there was enough to light a fire under me. I confronted Troy right away, anger boiling over as we argued back and forth. Poor Ace stood awkwardly by the doorway, and then Troy's girlfriend walked in, looking just as bewildered as Ace. I'd rushed upstairs in just my boxers, assuming it was just guys arriving, so I dragged Troy downstairs to finish our argument privately. After we calmed down a bit, Troy decided to take his girlfriend and Ace for a night swim at the creek. It seemed like a way to cool off and diffuse the tension, so I didn't protest. It wasn't until they'd left that I realized Troy had grabbed my shorts to swim in. Shorts with my keys, wallet, and smokes in the pockets. I was furious. When Troy came back, I confronted him immediately, demanding my stuff. He refused to strip down in front of everyone, and that only made me angrier. Ace, trying to prove himself, decided to jump into the argument, making things worse. But he must have known better than to push me too far. I've got a reputation for never backing down from a fight. Eventually, Troy and his girlfriend left again, this time still wearing my shorts. Ace stayed behind, sticking around for reasons I couldn't quite figure out. Maybe it was because Troy had left his backpack with all his personal belongings. Trying to move past the drama, I went back downstairs with the girl. Ace stayed upstairs, keeping company with my pit bull. We all figured Troy and his girlfriend would return later that night to grab his backpack, but they didn't. The next morning, Troy still hadn't come back. At first, we shrugged it off, assuming he and his girlfriend had gone somewhere and would be back soon. By the second night, though, it was clear something was wrong. No calls, no sign of them. It didn't make sense. On the third day, panic started setting in. I called Troy's girlfriend again, just like I had the day before, and this time, her phone rang. When she picked up, I could hear the fear creeping into her voice as I explained that Troy hadn't returned. She'd assumed he was back at the cabin. Now, alarm bells were going off. She and I started calling around to anyone who might have heard from him, but no one had seen or spoken to Troy. Desperation took over, and I called a few friends to come to the cabin and help search the woods. We searched everywhere, combing through the trees and the creek, but Troy had vanished without a trace. Eventually, I told Troy's girlfriend it was time to report him missing. She made the call, but when the authorities asked for his last known whereabouts, she told them the truth. The last time anyone saw Troy, he was at his cabin, arguing with me. That's when things got tense. My reputation for being a fighter preceded me, and the fact that we'd had a heated argument wasn't going to work in my favor. By the time the next events unfolded, Troy had been missing for 3 days, and the authorities officially declared him lost. That's when things took a sharp turn. The next morning, I was fast asleep, along with my date and Ace, when I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door being kicked in. The cabin erupted into chaos. Footsteps thundered across the roof, and the unmistakable shouts of a SWAT team filled the air. Before I could process what was happening, officers flooded into the cabin, weapons drawn. They had us on the floor in seconds, shouting orders. One of them, clearly on edge, barked, "I will shoot you, and I will shoot that fuck-dow's dog!" Ace, who had his face pressed into the floor, suddenly popped his head up, yelling, "Why are you going to shoot the dog? Don't shoot the dog!" I couldn't help but roll my eyes at Ace's timing, but thankfully, nothing happened to my pit bull. The chaos settled into interrogation mode. They separated us and started questioning me right away. 2 detectives played the classic good cop, bad cop routine, but it was clear I was their main focus. I was the last person to have seen Troy. We'd had an argument, and let's face it, my reputation for being hot-headed and quick to fight didn't exactly help my case. Then they dropped the bombshell. They'd found clothes by the hot tub with drops of blood on them. They pressed me hard about it, but I had no idea whose clothes they were or how they got there. No matter how much I insisted I had nothing to do with it, they weren't letting up. Meanwhile, search and rescue teams were combing the woods around the cabin, looking for any sign of Troy. Hours passed while I was grilled over every detail of the weekend. My patience wore thin, and I finally snapped. "Look," I said, "Troy's been missing for 3 days now. He could be dead or alive, but either way, you should be focused on finding him instead of sitting here trying to pin this on me." Unbeknownst to me, search and rescue had already found Troy. He was deep in the woods, miles from the cabin, passed out on a large rock and completely naked. He was alive, but barely. The first sign we had of this was the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air, growing louder as they approached. The detectives paused their questioning, and we all stepped outside to see what was happening. There he was, Troy, suspended in a blue rescue harness dangling from the helicopter. The chopper hovered low. trying to find a safe spot to lower him so emergency personnel on the ground could reach him. A wave of relief hit me. He was alive. That was all that mattered in that moment. A few days later, once the dust had settled, I learned the full story of what had happened. The night Troy disappeared, he and his girlfriend left the cabin for a walk to cool off after our argument. But here's the kicker. Before they left, his girlfriend had stolen his debit card. During their walk, the two of them got into an argument, likely about the card, and ended up separating. Troy's girlfriend found her way back to the main road and called for a ride, leaving Troy alone in the woods. She assumed he'd find his way back to the cabin on his own. Instead of returning, she turned her phone off for 2 days, avoiding Troy's angry calls while she went off partying with his money. When she finally turned her phone back on, it was to my frantic call, informing her that Troy had been missing for days. She had no idea he hadn't made it back to the cabin. Troy was lucky to be alive. By the time they found him, he was hours away from death due to exposure. He recovered, but things were never the same after that. As for me, I moved out of state not long after. The whole ordeal dissolved our friendship, and I've lost touch with everyone involved. Ace, my date, Troy's girlfriend. They're all scattered to the wind now, but none of us will ever forget what happened during those 3 chaotic days at the cabin. Some memories never fade, no matter how much time passes.